We're going to have a conversation about the intersection between MedTech and sports. And we have some really outstanding experts, and I'll talk a bit about their backgrounds, but we'll have plenty of time to really have some high-level questions that each speaker is going to cover, and we'll have time for some individual questions that are targeted towards Jay, Joshua, or Leslie. We want to acknowledge up front that you may have some questions. Some of the speakers may be available for after this session, so you can pose questions there. We may have some questions via Twitter, and we're going to do our best to answer questions from you, the audience. But this conversation primarily will be between us kids for the next 45 minutes or so. And with that, I'm going to share a bit about Leslie. Leslie is the executive director of USC's Center for Body Computing, CBC, and author of more than 200 peer-reviewed research publications. She's also an innovator and leader in wireless diagnostics, implantable computing devices, and human performance wearables. She's an active researcher with programs involving connected sensors and software with elite human performers, including military groups, professionals, and collegiate athletes. Her work is dedicated to providing users with continuous and protected information and actionable insights to improve and optimize their health and human performance status. Dr. Saxon has been recognized internationally with multiple prestigious awards, including the 2019 California Science Center Woman of the Year Award and Rock Health Top 50 Award for Digital Health Innovation. Dr. Saxon has spoken at various forums, including CES, TEDMed, DEF CON Black Hat, South by Southwest, and Wired Health. Oh, these are all cool conferences. She has been the subject of CNN documentary and is regularly quoted in the media, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, BBC, Fast Company, among others. So please help me welcome Leslie. Joshua is not a slouch either. Dr. Goldman is a health science associate clinical professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Orthopedic Surgery at UCLA. Dr. Goldman specializes in the care of athletes and provides high-quality care to patients of all ages with both medical and musculoskeletal issues. He's considered an expert in non-surgical orthopedic care as well as musculoskeletal ultrasound. In addition to his UCLA health science clinical practice, he is a team physician for the UCLA football, men's soccer, and women's water polo teams. He's previously served as a team physician for UCLA baseball, softball, rowing, and men's volleyball, as well as a volunteer team physician at the United States Olympic Training Center with the USA Hockey team and the Association of Volleyball Professionals. He's an associate director of the Orthopedics Institute for Children's Center for Sports Medicine and the associate director of the UCLA Steve Tisch Brain Sport Program and the program director for the UCLA Sports Medicine Fellowship. His research interests include sports-related concussion, sleep and sports performance, running medicine, and wearable technology in sport. He has partnered with organizations in the private sector as well on a number of these projects, including WHOOP and HitIQ. Jay has told me he is a native of Atlanta, and it is pronounced? Atlanta. It's pronounced Atlanta. He serves as the performance scientist for the Los Angeles Clippers of the National Basketball Association. He works alongside the team's performance, health, and wellness department for the last 6 seasons. He has assisted players and coaches with interpreting performance data from wearable devices to uncover actionable insights related to training, in-game management, recovery strategies, and injury trends. Porterfield graduated from the Viterbi School of Engineering at University of Southern California in 2009 with a Bachelor's of Science in Biomedical Engineering. During this time, he competed as a 100-meter and 200-meter sprinter on the USC track and field team between 2009 and through 2012, while working in Dr. Nina Bradley's development motor control lab, where he researched the effect of light on the development of balance when learning to walk. His research was later published in the Journal for Developmental Psychology in 2015. He's worked at the USC's Keck School of Medicine for the USC Center for Body Computing, a digital health research and innovation center run by Dr. Leslie Saxon. His role at the Center for Body Computing allowed him to combine his background in athletics and engineering to conceptualize and execute creative studies that integrated non-invasive biomedical sensors into athletic training to uncover new tools and methods for optimizing player performance. During his time with the USC CBC, Porterfield also continued his education, earning a Master's of Science degree in biomedical engineering with a focus on medical device and diagnostic engineering. Porterfield is a native of Atlanta, Georgia. Please welcome Joshua and Jay. So we have a really high-level question that I would like all of you to briefly respond to. What is your high-level perspective on how MedTech and data are supporting this industry being the sports industry? Who wants to start?
I definitely think these technologies have made their way into sport in a intriguing fashion, and while I don't think that they hold the same medical grade that the technologies that Dr. Goldman and Dr. Saxon utilize to diagnose patients, I do think that they provide us with some valuable insights to contextualize around why certain things might be happening or going on with an athlete that can be diagnosed, and then a medical decision can be made upon. So Dr. Goldman and I were talking a little bit about this before the panel started, and Dr. Saxon and I have talked about this for years, but the performance technologies that I primarily work with that may sometimes be deemed as medical technologies are simply a layer to medicine to help contextualize what is actually going on inside of the body and with the athlete.
Just to follow up on that, for me as a team physician, these technologies provide an additional window into that athlete's day-to-day life, their training schedule, their sleep schedule, their physiology, how their bodies are responding to the loads that we're putting on them. And all of that information are just additional data elements that we as clinicians are trying to use to keep our athletes healthy and to help them through their recovery process if they are in fact injured or working through a pathology. And so for me, these are really additional data points. You know, in medical school, we're trained very formally with our histories, our physical exams, we have our advanced diagnostic imaging, but these, for the most part, are really snapshots into what's happening with our patients. And these technologies are layering on top of that lots of data points in those in-between moments with the athlete. And so, you know, when I'm meeting with an athlete, for example, who's having a sleep issue, if I can get a 1 month window into what that athlete's sleep is looking like, that's going to be much more valuable to me than them trying to remember retrospectively or a single night of polysomnography in a sleep lab. And so really it's that added layer of data and information about what is going on with our athletes that is really helpful as we try to help them perform, but also help prevent injury or recover from injury.
Yeah, I think that's all very well said. I think layering MedTech onto athletic performance, it's very multidisciplinary because you need trainers, physical therapists, tightly cadenced physicians, and then you need to enfranchise the athletes. And there are all sorts of kind of culture around that, which you never want to do anything that would cause somebody to take some data and politicize it against an athlete potentially or weaponize it where they couldn't play, right? Because somebody's interpreting the data some way. And unlike medicine where there are like clear guidelines, you know, you do this with that, it's a little more kludgy in athletics. And so there is a penalty for disclosure in some sense. And so I think that you have to kind of balance all that and ask yourself, are you representing the interests of the team, which is to win, obviously? Are you representing the interests of the athlete? Often those things don't align well. Spent a lot of time thinking about that and finally deciding I'd rather be at the PA side than the team side, because these players are commodities to a large extent. And it's like, watch what you ask for if you want to work in this area, because you really see how cutthroat it is. But I think there's a lot of opportunity also to gain insights and keep these people going and show their value. How to do that, it's very early. It's not just physiology, it's metabolism, it's psychology. It's not enough to to measure an athlete and say you're elite. What are you delivering of value to that individual person? I think that's hard to do sometimes. So the more accurate the sensor is, that helps a lot, or the widget. So I love the idea that more, medical grade stuff is migrating in. The business models that support some of the sports performance techs are pretty predatory. They don't capitalize enough to show their stuff works, so they learn while they sell. And that kind of muddies the waters for a lot of people because they get cynical about it. But I think there has been some value, particularly in the last, 4 or 5 years, gained on player load and things like that.
Definitely.
And so what's really great about this conversation is you'll have unique insights into the end user, in this case, elite athletes, military professionals. Josh, as you think about your user, these elite athletes at UCLA, what's the importance of diagnosis versus important performance enhancement?
Yeah, Leslie touched on this a little bit, but when I'm using a tool as a diagnostic tool, right, looking for medical pathology, we have a much higher expectation for accuracy, reliability, reproducibility of those results. And that's inherent in the medical industry, right? So when you're trying to create a true diagnostic tool for use by clinicians, you're going to have a much higher rigor and expectation of the accuracy of that tool. So in that sense, as I'm using it on the diagnostic side, you can a little bit trust the system to do some of that due diligence for you. But also we require, because giving somebody a medical pathologic diagnosis has much more implications than on the performance enhancement side, where it's like, okay, you were a quarter second less fast today, right? Versus now, because I'm diagnosing you with a medical pathology, I'm withholding you from play. This may have implications at the college level for your ability to be drafted into professional leagues or your ability to play continuously. So again, much higher rigor when we're looking for a diagnostic tool as opposed to a performance enhancing tool. I think Leslie also brought up, as we are asking players to use these tools, when I'm using it on the diagnostic side, it's inherently benevolent for the athlete, right? Because I'm trying to help them get to the bottom of some symptom or pathology that they may be experiencing. When you're using it on the performance side, you're assuming that the athlete is interested in using it for that performance measure, right? And so our inherent benevolence as clinicians working diagnostically is sound. On the performance side, though, you absolutely want to be thinking about the interest in the athlete in doing interventions to enhance these performance measures you're looking at, right? So if all of a sudden I'm going to mandate that the entire football team wears sleep monitors, well, if 90% of them think they're sleeping fine and don't want me to mess with their sleep, how benevolent is that, right? And so as a clinician, if the team is coming to me and say, hey, we have this new device and we want to strap this to everybody and we want this data, I have to ask myself and think about the player and the team, which is, how is this going to help that individual athlete? Is this technology really designed for the betterment of that athlete? And if so, are they even interested in that betterment? Because a lot of times if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? And athletes get very superstitious when you start messing with some of their routines and habits. So really, I see my job on the performance side of making sure we're maintaining that benevolence, applying a little bit of that medical rigor to the performance devices, which don't have that, but still, it'd be really nice if we demanded that accuracy of them. And making sure that we are collecting actionable data that the athletes are actually interested in acting on.
Jay, did you want to jump in with something?
Definitely, I second that for sure. And a lot of the benevolence in it comes with relationship with the athlete, right? You have to have a history of benevolence with other athletes who someone that you're currently working with has talked to. Otherwise, they have the option to let you in or keep you out of whatever their data may be showing from a performance perspective.
I'm fortunate enough to meet with early stage medtech CEOs. Some of them have a DoD market that they're going after. Some of them have a sports market that they're going after. And Leslie, you have an insight into both worlds, the military and elite athletes. Can you talk a little bit about the differences or commonalities in those two groups?
Yeah, I mean, they're both high performers. The military, the tactical athlete, particularly after a 20-year war, they really have high loads mentally and physically, and measuring those loads and being able to restore them across those domains becomes very important. And I think nobody expects the tempo of future conflicts to be reduced. So how do we protect people? We asked to go 13, like in this last war, 13, 14 deployments to the Middle East from the time they're 22 till, they're 40, and environmental issues, and then, the kind of physical loads that they carry, and then having to keep reintegrating back here becomes really challenging. Yet we invest a lot in them, and they're highly skilled. So that's a challenge. So what we try to do there is kind of measure and provide insights, and then again, the worst thing you can do for someone in the military is to tell them they can't redeploy, or to give them some, to hurt them, job-wise. The same thing in the athletic field. And often there isn't a lot of choice. Like a coach wants to know, or the head of a squad, say, of 8 or 10 guys in a military unit, they're going to go to a game or to assault something, and they want to know who's a 4 and who's a 10. Very simple, because while in the military setting you got to play everybody, it's nice to know who's going through the door is a 10, not a 4, right? And so that is really hard to do on the fly, and to measure that. But we try to do the research so that at least we can find out in a private way, with them disclosing things to us, physiology, behavior, habits. The other thing good about those types of systems that collect and deliver back is that why does an athlete modify their habit? They're just coached to all the time. They're constantly being told what to do. At the collegiate level, if they're not in class, there's a golf cart they have 2 jobs, right? And at USC, our athletes, they're like professional athletes. They're not great here, but yeah. How many Olympic medals? Anyway, I had to do that, even though I trained here.
Let them know.
But anyway, so what is going to cause them to change their behavior, to modify or advance their health? Sometimes, you have to learn things yourself. People can tell you, but when you see that if you're not eating at the training table and you partied and you did something else, you're not a good student or a good athlete, light bulbs go off. And that's where behavior change and insights happen. So we try to deliver it very locally. So 80% can be true about everybody, but that's the 20% that's true for you, that if you see it yourself will often modify behavior. And for us, that's a win. I mean, the other difference is that in doing research with the military is that it's very disciplined, but it's very hard to operationalize it, to take it into a unit, because then they're disclosing everything and the commander knows, and they don't, you don't necessarily want what if your boss knew everything about your daily habits, physiology, and whether you were depressed at 8 in the morning and wanted to run for president at 4. That's the kind of stuff we're collecting. So it's pretty private stuff.
Yeah, there's some definite themes coming up: actionable insights, privacy, really empowering the athlete in a way that is benevolent. And we talked a little bit this in preparation, mental health for athletes, but specifically clutch performance. And Jay, I think you had some thoughts on Medtech and how it may fuse in terms of the needs of an athlete for clutch performance. Do you want to talk about that?
Definitely. And in terms of Medtech for clutch performance, I know that there's a few apps out there, namely Headspace, that's sponsored by the NBA, they're utilized by the NBA, or within our population, that athletes will utilize that prior to games to kind of like get into that mindset of it's go time, blocking out all the noise that's going on. But we also are mandated at this point to have a clinical psychologist on every team, which helps each of our athletes. And I know specifically within our population that clinician is greatly utilized, and we can see the results within our clutch performance. That's one of the things that we kind of hone in on, making sure that is improving as she is continuously talking to individuals.
And this is maybe also for everyone, how often are the athletes actually reviewing, evaluating these data? And I know there's medical grade data, there's other data that you're using to layer on. Are they using it a lot, a little? Are these apps and wearables really a part of their daily life? And maybe everyone could cover that.
They've definitely become more a part of their daily life. But I think it goes back to my first point about relationships. And it's like, if they see somebody that they trust utilizing and advocating for these different technologies, they're a little bit more inclined to at least ask the question of what is that doing? Whether they integrate it into their habits or not, that's up to them. And you kind of have to allow them to be the one that chooses to make that change in their behavior. At this point in time, when it comes to medical grade data, I do think that they possess that information. I think they legally have to be able to possess that information. But whether or not they're willing to dig into it and ask the questions around how is this performance and load monitoring based data being layered on top of that, I don't think that we're there yet. And I'm really advocating nowadays for players to ask the practitioners that work within their teams to show me the data. Show me what that means and why it's potentially leading to this issue that I'm dealing with. And as someone who works in the science field, you have to make sure that they know that causation is not always correlation, but that these droves of information could give you a lot of insight into why you have arthritis in your knee or why your ankle is feeling like that. One of the big things that we're able to show them is time on court. And we talk a lot about load and other different metrics that sound cool, but at the end of the day, time on court is one of the most understandable basic things. And sometimes when they see the amount of time that they spent on court relative to another player, and at this point, relative to not only another player on your team, but another player within the league, they can really say to themselves, wow, I spent that much more time on court, and so I ran that many more miles, I experienced that many more high-intensity events. My body really is going through it. And so while I may be mentally prepared to push through another workout and show myself that I'm strong enough, I also have a reason to tell myself that I can sit down, and I have objective information that can prove that to anybody who says that I shouldn't.
That's great. Joshua, what are your...
So we've been using wearable technology in our athletic performance teams here for a long time. For the past decade that I've been working with athletics, we've been monitoring all of this information, and they've been using more sophisticated technologies, because at this level you can afford more complex technology. And so we've had this in place for a long time. What I've seen in the past 3, 4, maybe 5 years is that all of a sudden the athlete is interested in it now. So we've looked at load data forever. We've had continuous EKG, GPS, all this kind of stuff for a decade that our athletic performance people have been analyzing and modifying load for the athletes. But for the longest time, it was just like, yeah, coach said I worked hard yesterday, so I'm a lighter load today. They just kind of accepted it. And now I think with the movement and the democratization of that technology down to the general consumer, now there's all these apps like Whoop and Oura Ring and things like that, where the consumer is now very interested and familiar with seeing this data. The athletes now, the first question they say when athletic performance puts something on them is, can I see my data? Right? Now all of a sudden, because this is very commonplace, our athlete today at UCLA wants to see all that data. The same thing on the pathology side. So we've been doing head impact research here with our football team for a decade, and they had helmet sensors that they wore for a 5-year study. I didn't get one athlete who ever said, can I see my helmet data? And we are just launching now a mouthguard sensor looking at similar data, but with the goal of behavioral modification based on the impact profile and whatnot by position. And as we're consenting, every single athlete, the first thing they said is, am I going to get to see my data every day? That's what they want to see. The athlete is now very much interested in their own biometric data. And I think that's a good thing, right? Because if we're just using all this data behind the scenes and telling the athlete what to do, they're much less interested, they're much less invested in that behavioral change like Leslie was talking about. And so having athletes say to me, I want to see my data, that's music to my ears. All of a sudden, that tells me, one, I'm collecting something they're interested in, and two, they're engaged enough to want to do that behavioral change, right? And I think we're going to see that moving into the consumer space. Obviously, we're here talking about elite performance, but the weekend warrior is just a retired version of my elite athletes, right? And so, every patient I see is like, oh man, I used to play college football and I got all this data, and now I just got this Whoop, wait, there's something else I can wear? Like, they miss that, right? And so I think we're going to see all this elite technology finding its way to the everyday consumer because, we're all a little bit of an athlete. So
That'll tweet. The weekend warrior quote. Leslie, what are your thoughts?
The only thing I would add to what was said is I think these are all good signs. It used to be that people only started to worry toward the end of their careers or when they got a major injury, and then it was suddenly like I'm really clued in because I want to keep playing or keep doing this job. I think we need to do a much better job at measuring restoration. Particularly in the military, it's all, you're a special forces operator, you've done this many deployments, you're this many shooting packages, this many elite training certifications, but really the restoration is equally important. And in elite athletics, and valuing that, measuring that, and understanding that science will extend careers. And I think push injury off to the right, because there are a lot of experts that already surround all of these areas. And the value of this is supposed to add value. And how does it add value? By predicting stuff early and mitigating it, right? That's, in my opinion, what it should be doing.
And
can I hop
please.
on the tail end of that? Yeah, so you bring up an excellent point, which is the decade of data we've been tracking is load data. We've looked so much at what's the load we're applying to the human, but the part that we missed and is just starting to evolve is the recovery, right? How is that load applied to the human affecting them? How is their body responding to this? Are we seeing signs in the tendon or in the muscle tissue or whatever it is we're looking at of an impending injury? And that's really that recovery restoration side I think we need to focus on. The final frontier is really the mental health piece you talked about. Our mental health wearable technology is not a thing that I know of. It's surveys asking an athlete or a patient or a human to be honest about how they're feeling, but we are not collecting biometric data. And maybe, Leslie, you can comment if you know of stuff in this space. QEEG, I don't know what it is, but we're not measuring objectively mental health. And so I think, as we've seen with some of the wearable technology, if we look at sleep or recovery, our body is not always feeling exactly how our mind thinks it is. And so I'd be really curious to see what evolves in that space of trying to pick up these early cues of anxiety, depression that an athlete may not even be sensing themselves, but is clearly brewing in the background.
And so you all touched upon empowering of your elite athletes and more engagement. Do you feel that results in healthcare professionals like yourselves having more to do? Are you more engaged? Is the doctor more in the loop now? Or are they less in the loop now? Does the athlete say, I got it, I got my data, I can figure it out on my own, coach? What are you experiencing?
Yeah, take that. Yeah, me too.
You. Go ahead.
Okay, so wearable technology in the everyday consumer's hands can be challenging, right? I'll start there, only because this is really complex data, right? What these two do is really sophisticated. We got a master's degree to be able to interpret all of this biometric data, and so we're just putting data in the consumer hand, and the number of patient messages I get about their Apple Watch EKG, which I know you have talked about a little bit, but we're providing data sometimes out of context, and so I think that can be terrifying for patients. I think on the same side, if there's pathology brewing, but they're misinterpreting that everything is fine, that can also be bad. So I think I love it because patients are engaged. They're involved in the process, and now they have ways to measure these things where it used to be, once a year you go to your annual physical at the doctor's office, and I check your blood pressure in this one snapshot, and we look at your heart rate, and I listen to your heart, and we listen to your lungs. And we're just getting this single snapshot, right? That's a bad way to take care of a patient. Now we're getting this continuous overlay of data. That's a lot of information for the clinician or the patient who did not go to medical school and doesn't have a master's degree in biotechnology to try and interpret this on their own. And so I think the technologies need to spend a lot of time with patient education. We need to trust that these technologies are, one, collecting accurate data, and two, interpreting this data appropriately for the patient so that they're not terrified that they're in atrial fibrillation at all times and running to the ER because their Apple Watch told them they need to be defibrillated. So I think it's good and bad, but there's certainly both pros and cons.
Are the Clippers coming to you more now that they have wearables and apps now? Have you seen an uptick in engagement?
Definitely. I mean, the engagement is going to always be there when, decisions get made based on the information. I think players are more inclined to listen to medical grade information. When a doctor says you can't play because of something like, atrial fibrillation, you're a little bit more inclined to listen to that individual. But then when we sit you out and the first thing you hear is load, and that's what gets placed on TV, and you think it's load management, that kind of takes a little bit of credibility away from the individuals that are in my place. So it's always more than load, and while that may not be what's displayed to viewers of the games, there's always a greater conversation that goes on behind closed doors that does involve medical grade information. It does involve scheduling information. This one game may not be the end-all be-all to prevent an injury from occurring for you, but we've identified it as a red spot in relation to some things that we're trying to manage for a pre-existing pathology or injury that may have gone on earlier in the season.
I just would add one thing to that. I just think maybe it's because I just hate authority anyway, but I think that what I love about this democratization of information is that we're leveraging the patient or the athlete in their own care. It's not this patriarchal, and it's there in every other sector of society, right? People didn't think people could handle their retirement package or their hotel We've democratized everything. You can look at how much a house costs. You have access to things. Health is the last frontier, and it's a right to have your health. We don't want to keep people dumb and down on the farm, so there's an education process. It challenges the medical model, and we have to look at ourselves and say, why are we so patriarchal? Why do we use a language nobody can even understand? No wonder they're scared. It's like people don't want to look at their money or their health. It scares the hell out of them because they don't understand it. They think, why can't we make that story different? Democratize the information, speak in a language they learn, leverage their insights for their own health. That's such a simple concept that rarely exists in medicine, and it's wrong. And discover together, very different concept. I have found more and more in the solutions that we build that I used to think you had to deliver all this education, and people with the right data at the right time can really figure out a lot. And then you're used at the top of your license. My time isn't then spent, in an electronic medical record generating a bill for 80% of it. I listen to the patient. I can actually spend more time with them because it's just like being more educated. They're so much more tuned on and opted in. They have a dog in the fight now. And so I think it's very virtuous. It has pain points. You want the sensors to be accurate, obviously, but I think it's a great era, and we're just going to practice medicine and human performance differently, and we're going to include the individual in the conversation. That's the good part.
Yeah, I think to add on to that a little bit, I think by handing the data to the players, you're going to start seeing a lot better information around, or a lot better contextualization around what goes into that, what that information is saying. If the athletes possess it, they can ask the data questions the same way that a performance scientist or a doctor would ask it questions, and then feed it back to you. Like, this is what it means with respect to how I felt on the court that day. They start giving you the mental health component of it without you having to objectively collect it from a device. You're hearing it from the device, so to speak, from the subject.
Is part of your role selecting the products that differentiate based on accuracy? Are we there yet where you say, this is a better wearable because it's more accurate, use this? Or are you willing to deal with the noise of less accurate products right now as this wearables field kind of not just emerging, but gaining more maturity? What are your thoughts on that?
Just really quickly, I mean, medical grade accuracy, if you can, ideally you want to put the medical safety piece behind it too, so it should be accurate. Directional can work. The new companies that come in and just claim all sorts, like I'm wearing a continuous glucose sensor now and I'm not a diabetic. And I'm just looking at it from the company that manufactures it, and then the software company that builds a layer on it that claims my hair can be more shiny, and if as a non-diabetic I don't get excursions that are wild when I eat a carb. That may be true, that may be not true, but they don't know that. And it's like that they haven't done the science. It's like the DNA companies, they're telling you which of your kids is going to be a Division I athlete. It's BS. And so it's a legitimate sensor or DNA test, and it's BS layered on it, and it's not science. So that's the kind of stuff that really aggravates the hell out of me. Do the research, and then maybe that's true. Maybe these glucose excursions are an early sign, and going to have metabolic syndrome and everything else. But right now, they don't know, and I don't know what they mean. If I go to 200 after a lemonade, but my hemoglobin A1C is like, nobody knows that. So at least say that and do the discovery. But to addict people for $400 a month and tell them that this stuff, that they need to keep their glucose in a narrow range when you have no idea what you're talking about, is prevalent. These are companies that are raising millions of dollars and trying to get into training staffs and everything else. So that's just not cool.
Josh, you want to say something?
In my world, the number of presentations we see from these companies with graphs that show everything goes up and to the right when we start using your technology, and it's a very sexy graph, and let me tell you, the app is even sexier that goes with it. It's just a parade of devices that claim these things. The two questions that I ask of every device we see is this device measuring what it says it's measuring? And 90% of the time with these sexy technologies, it's not. Right? So yeah, your data looks good, but they actually haven't done the scientific rigor to prove that it's actually in fact measuring what it says it is. If you make it through the loophole of you're measuring what you say you're measuring, the next question I ask of our staff is, well, what are you going to do with that data? Yeah, that's really interesting, and that'd be cool to know, but is it really worth spending all this money, making our players use all these devices, if you're not actually going to be able to do anything different because of it? And so that's really the second most important piece is, data for data's sake looks cool, the graphs look great, but are we going to change the way we're training, change the way we're sleeping, change the way we're eating? Are we going to do something different because of this data? And even once you make it through the loophole of accurate, that usually drops off, the next 9% of the 99% that we're going to say no to, is we're not doing anything different because of it.
Jay, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we're on our end, we're definitely a little bit more exploratory. We're willing to check out stuff and play around with it, so to speak. But similar to what Dr. Goldman was just mentioning on, the questions that you ask about the technology, for us, it's just like, is this a black box or not? If they're unwilling to give us documentation as to what this metric actually means, we already know we're kind of playing with fire. And so we kind of discontinue conversation with individuals that do that and do our own research on it, because at the end of the day, and I know we've all talked about this, we talked about this a little bit on the pre-panel stuff, it's like we like to keep it as simple as possible. Load sounds sexy, but load is nothing more than time on court.
So I don't know if Mead is in the audience. He runs business development for Bodyport, and their technology was developed over 5 or 6 years. They have published literature on their product, and it sounds like companies that take the time to differentiate with rigorous clinical data, you'll light up for that. It is more appealing than others. We had one specific question about the future of metabolic sensors, and that was for Leslie. Do you have any specific thoughts on that?
I'm really excited about those because I think that gets into that personalized nutrition and care and training. So coming up are sensors like lactate, glucose, ketones. Ketonic diets are very interesting for athletes and others, and whether you burn fat versus glucose is an interesting question. A lot of disease, what you use for fuel disease conditions like heart failure. So the ability to collect one of those measures a minute to inform nutrition training is really exciting. The thing about it is you have to be really humble though, and Jay knows this, but we've collected data over years where we're not used to seeing continuous data. So you have to learn what it means and benchmark it to something. So it takes a while to figure it out, but it's super promising, and I'm very excited about it. And it will allow for that customization of diet and activity and training that we seek. The other thing I'll just say about the sensors, and this is a story that Jay knows, sometimes they can really help you with certain issues. Like we had a kind of an accurate sensor, and years ago, Jay was asked to go put it on a bunch of severely wounded warfighters who were participating in a modified triathlon in New York, and we were like, should we go? And he went, and one of the things that he was able to show from that, and it wasn't a great sensor, and he came back and he said, Dr. Saxon, these guys are still elite athletes. They performed and that was to me like a very important message to these people who lost limbs and things like that. We've applied it to athletic teams where the coach thinks all the girls are lazy. and then you apply the sensor. It turns out he's just working him too hard, and they're losing in overtime because he had him run 5 miles, a midfielder in a soccer game, and they're not lazy girls, they're bad coach. So sometimes it can break a tie, and that kind of stuff is super interesting and valuable, right?
The most elite athletes will always adapt and create compensatory methods to achieve or execute whatever task that you ask them to, regardless of if there's a pain associated with it. It's our job to be able to identify those compensatory methods, which in some forms involves force plate technology, but also just observation. So it's going to be really interesting to see once athletes start utilizing these technologies on their own without someone having to tell them, use it for this purpose, use it for that purpose, how they end up selling it back to us. Because ultimately, most of us, along with the aspiring generation of athletes that are out there, are going to look to them to tell us what they need to do to become Michael Jordan. In the past, Michael Jordan used to tell you, just buy my shoes. But now he's going to be able to tell you, eat this, train this much, jump this many times. He's going to give you, the blueprint to becoming what he is. And some of that may involve fighting through pain. But being able to know that like there is an objective point that shows you when that pain point happens and how to adjust around it.
No doubt, and we're getting close to the end. So as part of wrapping up, I would love to get closing thoughts from each of you that you want this group, this audience to know. And I believe it's a mix of early stage CEOs, some in growth stage, and then some academics thinking about wearables and medtech. So whoever wants to start first, what's that parting thought you want to leave with this group before we end?
I would just encourage people to do the discovery and leverage the athlete in their own care, and it's a combination of software and hardware, and to measure more holistically.
Joshua?
Yeah, I think for me, as you are thinking about technologies, I think I would encourage you to think about your target audience, who's going to be using this and why, and design for that person, right? If you're designing for medical purpose, you need much more rigor. If you're designing for the everyday consumer, accuracy is probably less important, but you certainly don't want to be selling somebody a widget that doesn't do what it's going to say it's going to do. But I think the biggest takeaway is embed action into the device, right? If you look at the longevity, say you want to go consumer device of a wearable, it's less than a year at best, right? I mean, you probably know that data better than I would, but people don't wear these wearables forever. And if you're creating a company that relies on somebody continuing to use your technology, if you embed continuously actionable information in there, it's going to be a much more useful product for them long term, and the consumer is going to benefit from your technology, which is, I think, why most of us go into this anyways.
Definitely. I'd say be willing to put the power of discovery into the individual, into your target consumer's hands. And in order to do that, keep it as simple as possible. Start with the basic things that you can have a simple conversation with them about. And even if it doesn't sound cool, go with that and you'll get far.
Well, it's been a true pleasure. I would invite you all to join me in thanking the panelists.